welcome to the Draft Talks interview series, a new initiative by Defense Research and Studies. It is an honor to have one of the most revered and decorated General of the Indian Army, Lieutenant General D.S. Huda, PVSM, UISM, AVSM, VSM, and BAR, ADC, as our speaker on a rather challenging subject, the Indian Army Doctrine. Before we move to the subject, I would briefly reflect on the illustrious career of General Huda. General Huda was commissioned in the 4th Battalion of the 4th Gorkha Rifles in December 1976. He attended the prestigious Command and Staff College at Canada and was selected as the first Chief Logistics Officer for newly raised UN mission to Ethiopia and Eritrea. During the massive earthquake of Jammu and Kashmir in 2005, he led the military rescue and relief operations in the Uri sector, and as a Major General, he was responsible for CI operations in Manipur and South Assam. From 2012 to 16, he was stationed in Jammu and Kashmir, first as the Corps Commander and then as the Army Commander of Northern Command. During this assignment, he handled numerous strategic challenges along the borders, both with Pakistan and China. He planned and supervised the successful surgical strikes into Pakistan in September 2016. He superannuated in November 2016 after 40 years of service in the Army. And after his retirement, General Huda has been writing and deliberating extensively on geopolitical, strategic, and national security issues. And as a senior advisor for DRAS, General Huda has graciously agreed to share his wisdom on the subject, doctrinal changes in the Indian Army. Well, the task of examining, explaining, and simplifying the semantics of an army doctrine can be daunting and challenging. A doctrine in general refers to the principles and rules which determine an organization's action plan. And by the same logic, a military doctrine includes the principles which guide the armed forces in pursuit of national security goals. It is the collective wisdom and common language of the armed forces, as some scholars define it. The aim of the interview today is to acquaint our civilian and military audience, particularly the young scholars, with the evolution of doctrine of the Indian Army by examining the chronology of the doctrinal changes since 1947, scanning the shifts in the strategic landscape over time, and evaluating the various factors which have shaped the Army doctrine as we see today. Without further ado, we'll start the session. And my first question to General Huda. General Huda, going back in time, what template of the doctrine did the Indian Army inherit from the British Armed Forces on the eve of independence? And to what extent did the 1962 India-China War become a major turning point in Indian Army's doctrinal approach?
Divya, thank you very much. My pleasure to be here, and thank you for a very gracious introduction. So let me just jump into the first issue. So at independence, the Indian Army inherited the military doctrine that was based on the British way of war fighting in the Second World War. We must remember that World War II had just finished 2 years before our independence. So all the practices that we had were inherited from our experience during the Second World War. And what was that experience? See, a major part of the British Indian Army fought in Burma. So I know there were a few units which went to North Africa, to Italy, but our major experience was war fighting in Burma, which was fighting in the jungles, fighting in the hills, infantry domination, tactics. That was what was inherited from the British. The period immediately after independence was also a period of great churning within the Indian Army. So within 2 months, we were involved in the 1947-48 war with Pakistan. Also, there was a massive drawdown of the military forces. During the Second World War, the Indian Army was 25 lakhs. And during 1962, it had come down to about 5 lakhs. So there was a major drawdown of forces. We also didn't have a very experienced military leadership. I mean, the senior most British Indian officer was a brigadier. And so we could say that while, yes, the Indian Army performed well, but there was a lack of senior military leadership. So in this period of churning, that took place immediately after independence, really, we just continue to follow, the British way of fighting, the British doctrines. there was not much thinking about, an independent doctrinal development in the Indian Army immediately after independence.
Thank you, General Huda. General Huda, if we try to evaluate the specifics, can you elaborate on the evolution of the strategy and the doctrine post 1962 with special reference to the mountain warfare? And how have the mountain strike core evolved over time, and how would you evaluate the importance for Indian Army's posturing, particularly vis-a-vis China?
See, I think what the 1962 war brought home was not so much that we need to change our doctrinal thinking. I think what it brought home the need that we need much stronger military capability. You see, the military capability during the first 10, 15 years of independence had largely been, I would say, ignored or, given much lower priority. Which is why the performance of the Indian Army during 1962 war was something that we are not very proud of. So post 1962, great emphasis on mountain warfare, on fighting in high altitude areas, our preparations for those. There was also an increase in strength of the Indian Army. The unfortunate part was, again, as I said, great doctrinal thinking, particularly in terms of joint war fighting, did not evolve at this stage. And you see this reflected both in the 1962 war, when, for example, the Indian Air Force was not used at all. Even in the 1965 war, the synergy between the ground forces and the Air Force was lacking to some extent. I think only after 65 that, having learned the lessons of 62 and 65, I will say that, some changes in thinking, our ability to fight jointly, make joint plans, that started evolving at that stage. The Mountain Strike Corps, frankly, is a much newer sort of thought process. And I will come to that later when we talk about recent changes in India's doctrine with regard to how we look at the threat from China.
Right. Like you said, the 1962 war brought out some of our weaknesses, and joint warfare was still had yet to become a part of our strategy. But then the 62 war till now continues to be a mystery, and almost 6 decades after the India-China war, the Henderson, Brooks, and Bhagat report, which has been a controversial report, it remains classified. And to quote the former Defense Minister A.K. Antony, he states that the contents of the report are sensitive and of current operational value, and thus they can't be declassified. But the strategic environment and nature of warfare has undergone a lot of change since then. So this brings us to the next question. Is operational secrecy a valid concern here? And do you think tabling this report would encourage more well-informed debate on India's future military strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the short answer is it's pointless to keep this, still classified and as top secret. Most of it, frankly, is already out in public domain. It has already been, sort of leaked out. So it's already there in the public domain. We are also not the army of 1962. We have, become a much more advanced sort of military force. And I think, honest debate is required and should be encouraged in order that, lessons can be learned. What we did wrong, why did we do what we did? So I think those issues, not only for the military, but also for, researchers like you, are absolutely essential. And honestly, to say that it has, operational value, I think is a misnomer. I think it's being suppressed more for political rather than, operational reasons.
Right. Let's hope that for the larger benefit of the national security, the contents continue to be declassified further. But talking about threat perception, General Huda, the perception of threat remains central to shaping of an army strategy or a military response. So, how did the Indian threat perception change after Pakistan's surprise attack on India in 1965? You briefly commented on the same thing in the previous question also. And how do you think it reflects on the army strategy after 65 and 71 war?
So I think in some ways, 71 war sort of marks a watershed moment in India's military history. Firstly, it was the first war where the initiative was with the Indian side. Please remember 1947, 48 war, 1962, 1965 were all launched by our adversaries. The wars were started by either Pakistan or China. And so we were largely reacting to events. 1971 was the first time where, the initiative lay with us. We made the plans and we decided that we will prosecute, this war. And here you see all the three services jointly planning their operations. There was a great amount of debate and discussions on, war fighting plans between the three services as to how the war will be prosecuted. I think also one crucial part of 1971 war was the synergy between the political leadership and the military leadership. So you see that Field Marshal Manekshaw, told Indira Gandhi sometime in April 1971 that even though she wanted to launch the war early, he said we must wait and prepare ourselves well. And Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister, then accepted what the military chief or what the army chief had said. So as I said, you find complete synergy between the political leadership, the military leadership, the three services. And it's a classic case of how plans must be made and how war fighting must take place. And so it led to, I think, one of the finest moments in Indian history, when within 13 days, I mean, a whole new nation was carved out, Bangladesh. So 71 serves as a very good example of if you can harmonize doctrines and plans between the three services, take the political leadership on board, how success can be assured and ensured.
Jaludha, I think you're right in saying that 71 was perhaps the finest moment in Indian history. And in fact, instead of 1962, I think 71 was the defining moment or the starting point of a change in Indian Army doctrine.
Absolutely.
It brought the political leadership and the military leadership together. Jaludha, moving ahead to India's nuclear program, our nuclear journey from 1974 and to 1998 is believed to have elevated India's position in the regional balance of power. However, the civilian leadership was a little reluctant to involve the armed forces in the nuclear doctrine, as also elaborately brought out by Harsh Pant in his paper India's Nuclear Doctrine and Command Structure Implications for Civil Military Relations. So, what do you think were the military implications of India's nuclear capabilities?
So, you've correctly identified the problem, this reluctance of the civilian leadership, not to involve the military leadership in nuclear issues, I think is part of a larger problem of the nature of our civil military relations, which we are going to talk about later. But to come specifically to your issue of how does it impact, military strategy, military doctrine, military thinking? What has happened in the Indian doctrine is that conventional war fighting and nuclear war fighting have been kept completely distinct from each other. So there is no integration of nuclear assets into your conventional war fighting domain. It is just the opposite when you come to Pakistan, where you find that they talk about using tactical nuclear weapons as a way to stop India's conventional forces from achieving large scale success on Pakistani soil. So they fully integrate their nuclear assets in their conventional war fighting strategy. You see a similar thing also in China, where the PLA rocket force, which has both conventional and nuclear missiles, is very much a part of conventional war fighting doctrines. So I think this mismatch that exists in India is something that I think we need to discuss and debate and take it forward. There is just too much secrecy, even within the military about nuclear assets and how they will form a part of our overall national strategy. So that's an issue I think which needs great debate.
Right, right, General Uda. And if we take this discussion towards civil-military relations in general, there's been a disconnect between the stated doctrines and associated structure of armed forces on one hand, and the actual employment of the armed forces on a daily basis. And as Anit Mukherjee, the scholar, he's argued in his book, The Absent Dialogue, that this is largely a result of dysfunctional civil-military relationship, and I quote him here. And also in a recent article which you had co-authored with Happy Moon Jacob, you bring about a similar point which you made now, that developing a doctrine requires close interaction with political class to ensure that strategies are effectively implemented. But as you pointed out, this relationship has never been an easy one. So, in your opinion, how does this changing template of, or this challenging template, I should say, of the civil-military relations, how does this impact the execution of Army's doctrine?
So Divya, ultimately, we know that all wars are fought for a political objective. There has to be a political aim to any war fighting. And if you don't have extensive debate on defining what this political objective is, which the political leadership will tell the military, then obviously doctrinal development becomes that much more difficult. There are two problems in this. The first is we don't have a national security strategy that has been articulated by the government. So in the absence of a national security strategy, the military is left to draw out aims on its own, that this could be the possible political aim. If you have a national security strategy, at least there is some clarity on the overall direction, that the country wants to take and where the military fits into this. One is that we don't have a national security strategy. The second problem, when you talked about, dysfunctional civil-military relations, I think the problem is we don't have organizational structures where political leadership and military leadership can sit down on a regular basis and discuss, strategic ideas. So if you look at our current structures, you have the National Security Council, which is only a council of ministers. Below that, you have the Special Policy Group, which is primarily, bureaucrats and military officers, but there is no political representation in that. So there is a mismatch of how the military leader and the political leader can sit together, define your aims and objectives, carve out a strategy based on which then the military can, or the army can go and say, okay, this is what the political objective is, and therefore our military aims for this campaign should be A, B, C, D. Now, because that doesn't exist, developing a doctrine in the absence of this sometimes gives rise to many questions, whether this doctrine is aligned with political objectives. For example, there is a lot of talk that the so-called Cold Start doctrine has been prepared by the army, but it has no political sanction. So will this actually get executed in wartime if political sanction to this doctrine does not exist? So I think there needs to be much greater discussion, debate between the political and military leadership, a defining of political aims and objectives based on which the army can draw out its strategies and doctrines.
Two very important points you brought up, General Uda. I think first that we don't have a national security strategy, like we don't have a document, and second, there are no institutional structures or any organization to bring the military and the civilian leadership together to discuss. So, shifting to the nature of Indian doctrine, General Uda, a Carnegie paper, which was written in August 2020, titled The Army in the Indian Military Strategy. It contends that the Indian Army policy is guided by an orthodox offensive doctrine, a method of using force which favors large formations tasked with punitive incursions into enemy territory. While there have also been alternate schools of thought which view the Indian doctrine as largely defensive. So, how do you evaluate this author's assessment about the army strategy?
So I think to some extent the author is correct. I think he's focusing on our doctrine versus Pakistan, which is an orthodox offensive doctrine, which calls for large-scale offensive operations, going into Pakistan. So to some extent, he is right. I think what we need to think a little more about within the military, within the army, is what are the type of challenges that we could face that will require us to use military force. So, for example, what is the best way to deter Pakistan? Is it only through the threat of an all-out major offensive, or is there some way to have a series of, say, escalatory actions, starting with, say, a limited use of force? Those kind of deterrence threats, would they be better to ensure that Pakistan does not keep supporting terrorists and keep pushing in infiltrators, etc., into Jammu and Kashmir? Also, we need to discuss much more about if we are looking at a series of sort of escalatory actions, what are the risks associated with it? How do we establish escalation control? I think there is not enough debate, on these issues within the military, or even jointly between the strategic community and say the military. So we need to start thinking about what's the best way in which we can achieve our objectives without necessarily having to resort to an all-out war. And a similar thought process against China. How do we deter China from whatever actions it's doing along the LAC? How do we handle and manage our disputed areas along the LAC? Is it only through a threat of major conflicts, or is there some other way of doing it? And finally, I think we need to look at adoption of future technologies in our war fighting. That's another area I think we haven't given enough focus to, for areas of electronic warfare, cyber, intelligence, etc., of how we need to incorporate these future technologies into our war fighting methodologies and practices.
You're right, Januda. Certainly a case for much greater debate on all these issues. But let's talk a little about asymmetric warfare and post Kargil. India has not really fought any conventional wars. So how is this shift from traditional to non-traditional warfare, counterinsurgency? How is it reflected in the Indian Army strategy and doctrine over the last 2 decades? And can you elaborate these shifts with specific reference to 4 of the officially known doctrines? The 1998 Fundamental Concepts Doctrine, 2004, which was the revised version, and what we popularly come to know as the Cold Start Doctrine in the media, 2017 Joint Doctrine of the Armed Forces, and 2018 Land Warfare Doctrine. So we have these 4 doctrines, but still limited information in the open domain. So if you could reflect on this.
Okay, so I'll reflect on doctrinal changes that have taken place in the Indian Army, major doctrinal changes that have taken place. Somehow to relate it to specific published doctrines is a little difficult, because actually the publication of doctrines takes place sometimes much later than the doctrine actually having been already adopted within the army. So let me talk about some important phases in the Indian Army's doctrinal thinking. And the first phase was in the mid 80s. And in the mid 80s was a period of large scale military modernization. I think it was the first time that the Indian defense budget was almost 4% of India's GDP. So funds were being infused. There was large scale mechanization. Armored formations were raised. We had at this time 3 what we call strike corps, 3 strike corps for an offensive into Pakistan. And so our thinking at that time was, we finally have major conventional superiority over Pak military, and therefore we need to utilize this to have deep thrusts into Pakistan, capture high value strategic targets into Pakistan. That was the thinking, backed up by the fact that funds were available, equipment was coming in the mid 80s. Now, this thinking lasted till about the end of the century. And then two things happened at this time. The first thing that happened was both sides, became overtly nuclear. And so the thinking was that now, with this nuclear overhang, is it going to be possible to launch such large offensives into Pakistan to capture strategic targets in Pakistan? Would that cross Pakistan's nuclear red line? And therefore, is this strategy right or wrong? Also, at that time, 2001, we had Operation Parakram, in which both sides mobilized. Complete mobilization took place. We were at the border for almost 1 year. But again, I think among the political leadership, there was doubts whether, with these nuclear weapons on both sides, whether we can actually achieve our objectives and aims by sending large-scale mechanized forces into Pakistan. And so the period after Operation Parakram, 2002, 3, 4 was the time when India started looking at what is unofficially called the cold start doctrine, which was a swift launch of forces within 3 to 4 days going into Pakistan. Shallow thrusts remain, below the nuclear red lines and nuclear threshold, but capture some territory which could be later used as a sort of a bargaining counter. This is the second period of thinking about a change from what was called the Sundarji doctrine to the cold start doctrine. Now, as far as China was concerned, it was primarily a sort of a defensive strategy, that we will fight a strong defensive battle. We will limit any success that the PLA can have, and the cost imposed on the PLA will be so much that they have to think twice about whether they want to go to war. But it was primarily a defensive strategy. In the last 10 years or so, there has been a change in thinking about this. And the change in thinking is that we need a more offensive strategy even against China. And that's where, the raising of the Mountain Strike Corps, which commenced about, 8-9 years ago, formed a part of this strategy. Some writers have called this, that our initial strategy was deterrence by denial. Now it has changed to deterrence by punishment. That we still have a capability to do something offensive against China, and that it is not purely sort of completely defensive. So this is how sort of thinking has gone on in the army. Now, of course, we are thinking more about joint war fighting structures, integrated organizations, technology induction into the services. That's what is going to, I think, occupy our doctrinal debate and thinking, I think, over the next maybe a decade or so.
Right, Janindra, those are some very interesting and important insights about how the thinking started taking shape in the 1980s and how it evolved thereafter. Janindra, talking more about modern warfare, there's an obvious difference in the way battles are being fought now. And as you also mentioned that, the nature of battles has changed and there's a lot of emphasis on technology and information warfare. And we're living in an era of information wars. In that context, how do you view the Command Information Decision Support System, CIDSS, and Battlefield Management System, BMS, in supporting the Indian Army capabilities? And while India has not been able to fully implement these projects owing to financial constraints, how does our current capability in this field compare to that of China and Pakistan?
So, you rightly identified, modern warfare is information centric. And I think this is one area, where we have some way to go. So we are, as you said, introducing some systems, to strengthen our information capability. But I think our capability is not yet where it should be. For example, we have been insisting that we need to raise a cyber command for a very long time. Right now, what we have is a truncated cyber agency rather than a full-fledged cyber command. Uh, our information gathering ability, electronic warfare, all this needs significant upgradation. As far as comparison of capabilities is concerned, I think we have a fairly strong capability vis-a-vis Pakistan. But honestly, China is fairly way ahead of us in information warfare. So what the Chinese talk about is system destruction warfare. They say future wars will be of system versus system. And if you can destroy the systems, you will completely degrade the information network. And once, information network, command control is degraded, then the ability to fight a war becomes, that much lesser. I think we need to seriously look at Chinese capabilities and see how we have to build up in this area of, call it information warfare, call it system warfare. This needs much more greater attention than what it has received till now.
Right, Januda, you've brought out some valid concerns. Now, Januda, the relevance of intelligence in a war or a conflict has been largely agreed upon in principle and widely acknowledged by scholars, but it continues to be our Achilles heel. Despite having multiple institutional arrangements for collection of human it's remained one of our weak spots. And with specific reference to the army intelligence, is there a case for assigning a greater role to the core of intelligence? And trying to connect the dots with the recent standoff in Ladakh's Galwan Valley, a retired Indian Army officer had written in a newspaper, and I quote him, that a tactical level ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance model failed to detect or analyze any troop movement along the LAC. The PLA did not even try any deception. And there were similar elements of surprise which preceded since 62 and 65 in the 1991 war, 1999, sorry, the Kargil war. So, to what extent does this reflect on the military intelligence's inability to appraise the nature and degree of threat? And also, is there a lack of internal accountability?
So, Divya, I think uh, sometimes the role of military intelligence in India is not sort of that well understood, and therefore we sort of try and say the military intelligence failed to detect whatever has happened, say at Kargil or now in Eastern Ladakh. I think what we need to be clear about is that external intelligence is the responsibility of RNAW. The military intelligence has not been equipped with either the responsibility or the capability required to look, say, 40, 50, 100 kilometers beyond the border. They haven't, either got the tools for it, they don't have the mandate for it. That no, this is not your mandate. You are not supposed to look, that deep inside into enemy territory. So, I think merely pointing fingers at the military intelligence would not be sort of entirely correct. I think the problem is not the ISR or that we didn't know. If you recall and you look at the newspapers, the fact that the PLA has moved in for major exercises into Tibet was reported almost by all newspapers in January. That they have moved there and the major exercises, etc., are going on. I think where the weakness lies is not in getting the information, but in the assessment of intent. And I think that's the crucial part. If the Chinese have moved in 15, 20,000 troops into Tibet, what is their intent? Are they merely there to carry out training and exercises and therefore they will go back? Or is their intent much larger and that this buildup is there for maybe trying to do something along the LAC? I think that's where the real failure is. And that's where we need to focus in our ability to not only get information, but in our ability to interpret that information correctly. And that's where I think the external intelligence agencies, the Ministry of External Affairs with their offices in various countries, with their diplomatic staff, etc. They need to keep a greater eye on all this. Sure, I'm not saying that the military intelligence doesn't have its weaknesses. It has its weaknesses. Unfortunately, a lot of our assets have got deployed for counterinsurgency and counterterrorism duties. So a lot of intelligence assets have got deployed in Jammu Kashmir, in the northeast states, which also somewhat detracts from your ability to keep an eye across the border. So there again, we need to look at how our intelligence assets are, what capabilities they have, how to make it more potent and more professional. All that needs to be done. But as I said, I think the key lies in not merely gathering information, but interpreting it correctly.
Right, General Huda, I agree when you say that we shouldn't really be pointing fingers at the military intelligence. I'm sure they've had their success stories as well, but unfortunately, I think in case of intelligence, they're generally known by their failures, not their success.
True.
General Huda, let's move to major structural changes in the Indian military. And the two most recent ones have been the creation of the post of CDS and the proposal to set up joint theatre commands. So, how do you see these efforts towards jointness and integration figuring in the overall evolution of the Indian military doctrine? And do we need more organizational restructuring within the MOD to make CDS more effective?
So Divya, I think there is an increased understanding, within the military that we need to integrate, the three services. We need joint planning. We need joint war fighting structures. You mentioned theater commands. To bring all the three services together, the need to have integrated theater commands. Right now, the situation is such that if you take the Air Force commands and the Army commands, they're not even co-located. So there is no command, which is Air Force command or Army command, which is in the same station. They are all in different stations. So it doesn't, do much for synergy. So I think there is an understanding. How fast we are going to move towards it, I think is the real question. In the past, the services have got used to sort of planning in their own individual stovepipes. And so to break through that and think together is something, which the CDS now will have to do. And I think what it requires is a quiet debate among the senior leadership and the CDS. I think, sometimes proposals coming out in the media before they've even been discussed in the service headquarters, to me, is counterproductive. Because then it just sort of invites an unnecessary, debate among the serving community, among the veteran community. So a quiet sort of debate and discussion between the three service chiefs, the CDS, on what should be the shape of, these future organizations, what should be the command control arrangements, that needs to take place. I think we will get there, maybe slowly, because reluctances that are there in some services about integrated commands, would have to be sort of overcome and broken down. But as I said, there is understanding that we need to move ahead into these areas. The reorganization of Ministry of Defense certainly required. We've been talking about an integrated Ministry of Defense, where the uniformed people and the civilian staff, are completely mixed in various organizations. There's greater understanding of each other's position. That needs to be done. The Department of Military Affairs, created under the CDS, is one such step. But I think we need a fully integrated Ministry of Defense. It'll bring in much greater efficiencies. It'll speed up various processes, including weapon procurement, etc. If you have a completely integrated Ministry of Defense.
Thank you, General Huda. General Huda, to conclude this discussion, last question to you. There has been a traditional dominance of the army within the military doctrine. And while efforts are being made for jointness, as you very well highlighted, in the light of current the India-China border tensions and the ensuing heavy deployment and mobilization of the forces along the border, what role, resources, and responsibilities will be assigned to the sister forces? So your realistic take on this?
So Divya, the dominance of the Indian Army in the three services is because one of its size. I mean, it's 1.2, 1.3 million strong army, and because of its role. See, if we look around as to where our strategic challenges are, we are seeing unsettled borders with Pakistan, along the line of control in Jammu and Kashmir. Last year, we had more than 5,000 ceasefire violations along the line of control. So the border is extremely, extremely active. On an average of 14 ceasefire violations are happening in a day along the LOC. There is infiltration, which is coming in from Pakistan. So it's an active border. So a lot of attention has to be paid to this border. Coupled with this, now, of course, what are you seeing now is almost 50,000 soldiers, they said, from either side or from each side deployed along the LAC in Eastern Ladakh. And continuous sort of tensions that are going on. We today only heard about an incident that took place in Sikkim. A physical clash between Chinese and Indian soldiers took place with injuries happening on both sides. So therefore, if you have unsettled borders, you have existing tensions along the border. Obviously, the army will continue to get that strategic attention, and it's because it is required. Can we sort of accept now the kind of thing that has happened in Ladakh, for example? Can we accept this happening in Arunachal, that the PLA comes in and occupies some areas which are considered disputed? How do we react to all that? So therefore, the army, I think, also in the future will continue to have an important role as far as the three services are concerned. But having said that, I mean, the other services also have an extremely vital role to play. I mean, we should not overlook that. The Indian Navy, for example, has a major and vital role to play in the Indian Ocean. In case of a conflict, this is one area where we can put actually strategic pressure on China, by sort of threatening their seaborne trade, by dominating the Indian Ocean, preventing the PLA Navy from entering into this area. So the Navy has its own vital role to play. Similarly with the Air Force, I mean, they have great advantage in air operations over Tibet, because the PLA Air Force is operating from high altitude airfields. There are limitations on payloads, etc., that it can lift with. So we have an advantage. So even if there is a land conflict, the Indian Air Force is going to play a very vital role. So I think all services are important, but seeing what is happening along our borders, the conflicts that are sort of raging there, the Indian Army will continue to sort of have have a prominent role in the three services.
Right, General Huda, you're right in saying that for obvious reasons, we'll be seeing a dominant role being given to the army. But with this, our discussion today comes to an end. And thank you so much, General Huda, for sharing your knowledge on such an important and complex topic. I am sure it will leave all our listeners much better informed and will add to the existing scholarship on the subject. On behalf of the entire DRAS team, I thank you once again. And personally, it was an honor for me to interview you.
Thank you very much, Divya. My pleasure interacting with you. Great questions you asked.